All right, John chapter 2. All right, so I wanted to start off with just a quick summary of John chapter 2 with a little joke. Okay? So the joke is, I was walking through a parking lot one day and found $100 on the ground. I immediately thought to myself, what would Yeshua do? So I turned it into wine. Right? Which goes on to our theme that we were talking about today. All right, hey, we got to do what he did, right? So, okay. So just as a quick overview of what we learned so far, this is where we're at. We're at chapter 2. We finished chapter 1, the prologue. We did the second half of chapter 1, talk about the witness and discipleship. So now we're getting into the book of signs. This is where we get the 7 signs of Yeshua, of who he is. The proof that who he claimed to be is true. So we'll finish chapter 2 today. And of course, chapter 2 is going to focus on the wedding and the temple. Those are the 2 locations that we're looking at today. And the next part of the section here is the guy's going to talk to Rabbi, or Yeshua's going to talk to Rabbi, and at the sacred well is chapter 3 and 4, which, Lord willing, we'll get to next week. All right, so just want to let you know where we're at in the book of John. All right, so let's just jump right into it. In the book of John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. It says, on the 3rd day, there was a wedding at Cana in the Galilee. Yeshua's mother was there, and Yeshua and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, Yeshua's mother said to him, "They don't have any wine." Yeshua said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with you and me? My hour hasn't yet come." His mother said to her servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, there's a lot in this section here that we want to take a look at here. So first of all, it talks about the 3rd day. We talked about this last time, that the 3rd day from what? Well, if you look at chapter 1 and considering on here, it's considered the 7th day from where we started in the book of John. Now, the 3rd day can have many different reasons or meanings here. The 3rd day could be referring to his resurrection, because that's a sign he's going to do in this chapter. He's going to be referring to that, and also at the temple. So that's very possible too. But I think the idea is that if this is the 7th day, what day would that be on a Hebraic calendar? What day would that be? That would be the Shabbat, right? That would be the Shabbat. So John is probably pointing us here to something about the Shabbat here, although I don't think it's the actual Shabbat in reality, but by counting the days, he's pointing us to the Shabbat. So most likely, it is taken to be that John is trying to emphasize the creation week, right? The 7 days of creation, and then the 7th day is Shabbat, when God rested. And we see that also in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, right? We all agree that was about creation. And so John is emphasizing that 7 days a week when God rested. And then this is the 7th day, and the sign represents taking place on the Sabbath, right? That's what the sign represents, and we'll see here in a moment. So just keep that in mind. And this kind of fits in with the rest of the book of John. For throughout John, Yeshua's redemptive works are connected to the Shabbat. And we'll see this later as we go through the book of John, John chapter 5, verse 16. John chapter 7, verses 21 through 24, and John chapter 9, verse 16, when Yeshua is doing these works, they're taking place on the Sabbath, right? And so John is trying to make this connection between the Sabbath and God's redemptive work. So there's a connection there. So this is most likely what the 3rd day is trying to point us to here. Right, the resurrection, exactly. And that's going to go into the second half of chapter 2, right? That's what we're going to talk when we talked about the temple. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. There's lots of ways we're going to understand the 3rd day. The 3rd day is a wedding, and we're going to talk about the wedding. What does a wedding mean, or the feast? When the Jewish person back in the 1st century thought about heaven or the world to come, what did they think of? They thought of a big banquet, sitting down with God and eating with him in a big banquet. So this idea of a wedding is very similar to that. So again, this is all kind of connected to this understanding of the world to come, the price to be paid, and things like that, as we'll see. So when we talk about the wedding in the first century, a wedding celebration could last as long as a week. Right? That could be a long time. And the financial responsibility lay with the groom, right? The groom would have to be responsible for making sure he was fed, providing for the wine, and things like that. So he was responsible for that. To run out of wine or supplies in the first century during a feast like this was a big shame. You bring you and your family a shame in this type of culture. So you want to make sure this didn't happen, make sure there was enough to go around. Yeah, it would be probably, but not as much. And we don't have weddings that last, a week. Because man, paying for one wedding is enough. Imagine for a whole week. Yeah. So, but yes. So I said the groom was responsible to pay for the wedding. So most likely, what's going on here is that this was probably a friend of the family of Yeshua, and that's why they were all invited, and that's why most likely Yeshua's mother was kind of in charge or taking participation in the details of the wedding itself. It's very possible. But speaking of, notice that Yeshua's mother's name is not mentioned. And in fact, throughout the book of John, her name is never mentioned. So it's always Yeshua's mother, right? Or woman, right? But her name is not mentioned, which is Mary. Here's something to think about, though. When is the next time in the book of John do we see Yeshua's mother? When is the next time?
Her sons come to see him?
Nope, that's not in the Gospel of John.
Oh, okay. Really?
Does anybody know? The cross. The next time we see Yeshua's mother again is at the cross. That's interesting. I wonder why that is the case. So we see that in the Gospel. And that's in chapter 19, verses 25 to 27, if you want to look ahead, which we'll get there. So she comes to Yeshua, and she says, they run out of wine. Now, she's probably going to Yeshua because she's learned to rely upon him. Most likely, we don't know for sure, but most likely Joseph has probably passed away. He's never mentioned. And so she, as being the firstborn son, she's probably relied upon him for other things. And so she comes and we're out of wine. And what's Yeshua's response? So he's like, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Well, okay, we weren't talking about your hour. We're just talking about wine, right? So what are you talking about? So John is using this kind of almost humorous understanding that somebody, and we'll see this throughout Yeshua's conversations, somebody can come to Yeshua and ask one specific question. Yeshua goes, Yurt! He goes the opposite direction, bringing it to what he wants to talk about. And this is kind of like what's going on here. And I think the reason why this is the case is because we're supposed to see something beyond this current situation, that we're pointing to something else. And so when he says, my hour has not yet come, what is he making reference to there? What does he mean by hour? Time to step into his ministry. Okay, time to reveal himself. Okay, so what does the wine have to do with him stepping into his ministry and revealing himself? What is the hour? Well, when we come to questions like this, especially in the book of John, what we want to do is, does John use this phrase anywhere else throughout the book of John? And the answer is yes. And so we see this later on, and we'll see how many times he actually uses it. But he uses it in chapter 13, verse 1. It says, and Yeshua's hour has now come. And then he also says in 17, verse 1, Yeshua's hour has now come. So what hour is he making reference to? The hour of his death, right? What he came for. That's my hour. And actually, several times throughout the book of John, he says, and his hour has not yet come. His hour has not yet come. Then we get to chapter 13, and his hour has come. Guess how many times he used the word hour? 7 times. Good job. You got it. 7 times throughout the book of John. I think it's 3 times. 4 times his hour has not yet come, and then 2 times his hour has come. So it's just interesting. Again, the number 7, as we'll see as we go through the book of John. Okay? And he says, my hour has not yet come, but again, what does this have to do with wine? What does this all have to do with that? Well, we'll find out in a second. Now, notice here also that even though he slightly rebukes his mother here, is like, what does this have to do with me and you? What is his mother's response? Did she say to him, hey, you don't talk to me like that, I'm your mother? No. What does she do? right? So probably wasn't the answer she was looking for, but what her reaction tells you something. So I wanted to read something here. I think this is rather interesting. In saying to the servants, do what he tells you, Yeshua's mother shakes off the gentle rebuke and exemplifies the best kind of preserving faith. Like the Canaanite woman who was rebuked for her presumptuous approach, but was preserved and was praised for her faith in Matthew 15, so Mary is rebuked for presuming on the family tie, yet displays faith that is perfectly content to leave the matter in Yeshua's hands. That this sort of pattern occurs elsewhere in John, and Yeshua initially refuses the request for assistance and then proceeds to help it in his own way, often in response to further demonstration of faith. We see this in chapter 4, verse 47, and chapter 11, verse 21 through 44. In short, in chapter 2, verse 3, Mary approaches Yeshua as his mother and is reproached. Yet in 2, verse 5, she responds as a believer, and her faith is honored. She still does not know what he will do, but she is committed to the matter to him and trusts in him. Okay? So we have the hours never come. She says, okay, do whatever he says. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know if he's going to go get his disciples to get some work out there and get some wine for us, but just listen to him. And so the servants are also faithful as we read through the story. They're also faithful to the story, as we'll see. So let's move on. So in verse 6 it says, now there were 6 stone jars used for a Jewish ritual of purification, each holding 2 or 3 measures. Yeshua said to them, meaning the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them up to the top. Then he said to them, take some water out and give it to the head waiter, and they brought it. Okay, so let's stop here for a second. It says here the 6 stone jars. Now, why were the jars stone? I mean, you would think that because stone is very expensive, you have to hew it out and things like that. Clay jars are much easier to work with, right? And they're cheaper. But why 6 stone jars? Well, stone, the reason why is for purification, because he talks about this purification. Most likely this wedding was had to do with probably a priest was around. That's what some people say, because they had to be pure. But this idea is that stone does not absorb impurities into itself like clay does. Clay absorbs, and so if you put something dirty in there, you kind of ruin the whole pot and it has to be smashed or it can't be used anymore. But stone doesn't have that absorption into its material, so it can last. So even if you get something dirty in there, you can still wipe it out and clean it and not have to worry about being contaminated for the next water that's coming in. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Now the question is, why 6 jars? Because John seems to want to emphasize there were 6 jars. He didn't just say there were some jars there, but he emphasized 6. Well, why 6? Anybody got any guesses why there might be 6? 6 days of the week? Okay. That's very possible. Creation, 6 days a week. Okay. Well, before we answer that question, let's see how much. It says each was holding 2 or 3 measures. Now, what does that mean? So altogether, it was holding about between 100 and 150 gallons of water, which is a lot. That's a lot of water, right? And we know what happens to that water. So the question is, why is 6 jars? Well, I was looking at some commentaries to see what they would say, and some were saying, well, this is representing Judaism, and Judaism is incomplete, and it's it needs to be replaced with the 7th jar, which is Yeshua, and so it's being done away with or being replaced. And it was interesting when I was going through this, looking at a lot of commentaries. There was a lot of replacement in these idea of Yeshua is replacing the temple, or he's replacing the wedding feast and all that stuff. I was like, okay, wow, interesting. So the idea of the 6 jars is, well, that just happened to be 6 jars. That's it. Okay, yeah, that's not very fun. I'm sure there was 6 jars there, but I mean the emphasis of the 6 is interesting. I tend to understand that the idea of the 6 jars is that it's still pointing to something else. In other words, what the sign we will see here later, the sign that he's pointing to is not something in and of itself. It's pointing to something else. It's one was short to show that it's showing us something that also we need, and we're going to discover that in a second here. So just keep that in mind. We're not told why it was only 6 jars, but I think given the sign and what the chapter 2 is about, I think that's what it's pointing to. The idea is not fully where it's pointing to. Okay. So here's another question. We know the story, right? When did the water turn to wine? When did the water turn to wine? When he poured it out? Who poured it out? When did they pour it out? Okay. So when we look at the text carefully, I like the way the TLV translated it because they translated literally when it says here, take some water out. Literally in the Greek, what it says here, draw out it and give it to the head waiter. So that word draw there is always in reference to water. It's always in reference to water. It's never in reference to anything else. So what's interesting about it is when he's telling the servants, okay, get a cup and draw it out to the head waiter, it was still water. So when did it become wine? Well, let's continue reading. Maybe we'll figure out. All right. Chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, it says, now the head waiter did not know where it had come from, but the servants who had drawn out the water knew. And the head waiter tasted the water that had become wine, and he called the bridegroom. He said to him, everyone brings out the good wine first, and whenever they are drunk, then the worse. But you've reserved the good wine until now. Yeshua did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Okay, so going back to our question, when was the water turned to wine? Right. Sometime between they took it out was water, and when they gave it to him, it became wine. It's interesting, right? So back then, this is interesting practice when I was studying this. Wine had a high alcohol content. So what they would do is they would water down the wine so it wouldn't be so strong. And so the idea is that there was water already in the wine, that in the sense of, so it's almost like a light beer, almost the water down to that level. At least that's how it's been described to me. Okay, so this idea of water and wine together. Now it says here that this is the first of his signs. Now it could be the first of the signs that he ever did. That's very possible, or the first of the signs that we don't see in the book of John. Okay, so let's just assume for a second that this is the first sign. I'm not using the word miracle, but I'm using the word sign because we'll see here in a second of what Yeshua did. Okay? Do we know of anybody in the biblical history that did something with water that turned it red?
Yes,
Moses. And when did Moses do that? That was his first plague, right? So here we have a relationship between Moses and Yeshua here in some level, right? But when Moses turned the water into what? What did he turn the water into? Blood. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? That was God's wrath. But when Yeshua turns the water into something red, it is considered a blessing. Okay? So that's just something to keep in mind as well. The idea is that when you look at the book of Revelation, right, whenever wine is mentioned in the book of Revelation, how is it mentioned in the book of Revelation? It's always in reference to wrath. But here it's mentioned as something blessing, something good. So and we'll talk about that in here in a second. So the idea is then that in the book of Revelation, it's about wrath. Okay, so the question is, does Yeshua break the tradition of bringing the bad wine first? Does he break that tradition? Well, in the sense of what is the wine that he brings first? He brings the gospel message, right? He brings the good news. But at the end, we see in the book of Revelation, what does he bring? His cup of wrath, right? The cup of wrath, which is the bad wine, second. So in a sense, when you put it together with the book of Revelation, when you put them together, Yeshua is actually keeping the tradition of bringing the good wine first, and then second, the cup of wrath, which is interesting. Okay? All right. In verse 11, we see here that what John is doing here is what's called a bookend. Okay, so he starts off with verse 1, he says, this is a wedding in the Cana of Galilee, right? And then verse 11, he says the same thing, in the Cana of Galilee. So this is a bookend to show the section that he wants us to look at. This is a section in of itself to see what's going on. Now, it says here that it was revealed to his glory and disciples believed in him. Whose glory did the disciples see? Did they see the Father's glory? Did they see the Spirit's glory? No, they saw the Son's glory. Does that sound familiar? Okay. Now, what's interesting about this glory is the glory is not visible to all who had seen the miracle. The glory cannot be identified with the miraculous display. The servants saw the sign, but not the glory. The disciples, by faith, perceived Yeshua's glory behind the sign, and they put their faith in him. So I said this: you can see the sign, but you won't see the glory unless you couple it with faith. It's the faith that comes about that you see the fullness of what the sign is pointing to. And what is the sign pointing to? Is John revealed to what the sign is? Because remember, whenever the word miracle is never used in the book of John, it's always referred to sign or works. And the idea is that sign always points away for itself. It's pointing to something greater than the situation that's going on, which takes faith to see it, as we'll see throughout the book of John. Okay? But here, the good wine is last, but we know that the wine is going to be bad later on. So what does this water and wine represent? Well, let's continue on. Let's continue on the book of John, chapter 2, and see if we can find a connection. All right? Then after this, Yeshua went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and disciples, and they stayed there a few days. The Jewish feast of Passover was near, so Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found the merchants selling oxen, sheep, doves, also money changers sitting there. Then he, meaning Yeshua, made a whip of cords and drove them all out of the temple, both the sheep and the oxen. He dumped out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Now, I don't want you to think I'm reading too much into the text, and I may be, but I wanted to bring this up. What's interesting about it is right after we have the sign of the water into wine, John has this interesting location of where they're going. He just kind of throws it in there. And usually when you see John throw something in there randomly like that, it's not really random when you look at the whole book of John. So this is something to consider. I'm not saying this is exactly what it means, but it's very possible this could mean this way. Is that right after we see the sign of the water and wine, it says that Yeshua went down. And then he goes back up. What does that sound like to you? He goes down and he comes back up. Sounds like the resurrection. It's very possible that's what John may be alluding to. I mean, maybe reading too much into it, but I figured I might share that. Okay? Because to go up to Jerusalem is on a mountain, so you naturally go up. But the mere fact that John put that in there is pretty interesting. Okay? Now, when we get to this overturning the tables and what's going on here in the temple, this is one of the few times that John aligns itself with the story of in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay? So this is one of those rare times. But there's a major debate about this because when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, whenever we talk about the overturning of tables during this Passover time, it's always mentioned at the end of Yeshua's ministry. But here in John decides to put it at the beginning of Yeshua's ministry. So there's some debate. There's debate. What is John simply taking this event and putting it in the front of his ministry for a literary purpose? Or is it trying to say that this is something Yeshua did every year? Or he just did this time and then, got the leader's attention and then do it to the end of his ministry when they're waiting for him? We don't really know. So it's possible either way is possible. So I'll just leave that to you to think about how that works. Now, it talks about here that why did Yeshua overturn the tables and get out the oxen? What we've been traditionally told that the reason why he did this was because there was corruption going on, there's stealing going on. But that's not the reason that's given for why he did that. That's not that we're reading into the text what is not there. So the reason is that there were simply money changers and animals there when that should not have been the case. That should not what was going on. And actually within Sanhedrin and the leadership and the political powers that be, there was some kind of struggle that was going on whether that should even happen in the first place in the temple courts. But be that as it may, this is what's going on, and this is what he did. Now, it talks about he made a whip. Now, why would Yeshua need a whip to drive the people out of drive the money changers out? That seems kind of violent, right? Why does he need a whip? For the animals, right? So the other times in the Synoptic Gospels, when he talks about overturning the money changers, it doesn't mention a whip, but it also doesn't mention the animals either. So most likely he had the whip not to beat people out, as some people try to say. He was probably making noise to get the animals to get out quickly. That's probably what was going on. So, and most likely he did not bring the whip with him. It says he made it most likely on the fly, something he made out to, because, it's kind of like bringing weapons in a temple was probably not a good idea. So something probably he made while he was walking around. It's very possible. Go ahead.
What's the problem? Because it seems like when you read the Torah, it seems like you can, sell your animals and buy more when you get to the temple for sacrifice. Was the problem was the actual transaction being on the temple ground?
Yes, that's what the text seems to indicate. Right? That's what it seems to indicate. So, most likely what was going on here is that if Yeshua was any old person, he probably would have been arrested on the spot, most likely. But because of his reputation and with the people following him and things like that, they went to him and asked him, by what authority do you do these things? And so this is the debate of whether he did this the first time, second time, or is just John literally putting this in the text at the beginning for a specific purpose. I'll let you decide on that. Okay. So then moving on. So after he does that, verse 16, those selling doves, he says, "Get these things out of here. Stop making my father's house a marketplace." So exactly. So in his father's house, making marketplace. Now notice he calls his father's house. And their reaction is not the reaction we see later on in chapter 5 and chapter 8 when he's talking about his father, right? They consider him equal to God, but that's not what's going on here. And I think the reason why is because they were concerned with his authority, the ideas of authority, why he's doing these things. But when he says this, let me just read the text. So his disciples remembered that what was written, "Zeal for your house has consumed me." The Judean leaders responded, "What sign do you show us since you are doing these things? Destroy this temple," Yeshua answered them, "and in 3 days I will raise it up." So when he says these words, "The zeal for your house has consumed me," he's quoting, what is he quoting? Psalm 69:9. That's what he's quoting. But also some people think he's making an allusion to Zechariah 14:21, where it says, "And on that day there will no longer be a merchant in the house of the Lord Almighty." Or in Malachi 3:1-3, where it says, "And suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple to purify the Levites with refine them like gold and silver." So this is also too what he could be alluding to as well. And it says here that when the disciples saw this or they heard this, they believed they recognized when they saw this they remembered this. Now we don't know if this is before while this was happening or later on after his resurrection they remembered this. We don't know. John doesn't tell us. So he says, "Destroy this temple," and Yeshua says, "and I will raise it up in 3 days." Right? Or in 3 days I'll raise it up. Now, and I don't want to get into the debate too much. It doesn't say after 3 days. It says in 3 days. We'll talk about it some other time. Okay. But okay. So he says this, and so we all know the story. So let's continue reading. It says here in verse 20. He says, "The Judean leaders said to him, 46 years this temple was being built, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was talking about the temple of his body. So after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he was talking about this. And then they believed the scriptures and the word that Yeshua had spoken. So the idea is that, again, we're going back to this. Now, in the Synoptic Gospels, it talks about the sign of Jonah. Remember, he says, this generation will not receive a sign except for the sign of Jonah. But in the book of John, it never mentions the sign of Jonah. Well, because it mentions it here. This is the idea is that the sign that he is who he is, the authority by which he has to do what he does, is the sign of his resurrection. Right? That's the sign. Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. So this idea of destroying his temple, making reference to his what? His death, right? His death that he was going to die. And, of course, in 3 days, he's going to raise it up, meaning his resurrection. Now, again, when I was reading through a lot of commentaries on this was a big factor in a lot of Christian commentaries about Yeshua replacing the temple, the inadequacy of the temple and the Levites, which there's some truth in that per se, but this is not about replacement per se. This is about the fulfilling what has been pointed to his whole time. And so a lot of times we got to be careful that when we see language like this, or where you encounter somebody that's saying this, just gently remind them that they may be reading into the text, and the text is not necessarily saying that. What it's saying is that there was a use for the temple. There was a purpose for the temple. The temple did accomplish things. And yes, the temple was pointing to Yeshua. So a lot of times Christians only want to point to the part of what Yeshua is pointing to and only focus on that, which is a good thing. But they forget also what the purpose of the temple was as well. And so we need to keep a balance of both sides and not just favor one over the other. Okay, so John never uses the word replacement, but I couldn't tell you how many times I read the word replacement going through this section of commentaries. Oh, he's coming to replace. He's doing this, that, and the other. I'm like, I just don't see it. So we need to be careful when it comes to that. Of course, he's talking about the temple, which is his body, right? His body is the temple. And what's inside the temple? The presence of God. Okay, that's what's inside the temple. All right. So, and they remembered that he raised him from the dead, and they believed. Okay. Continue on. Verse 23. Now when he was in Jerusalem for Passover during the feast, many believed in his name, seeing the signs he was doing. Now notice, John is making reference to additional signs that are not mentioned in the book of John, because as we've seen already at the end of the book of John, many signs that he did, but John only mentioned specifically 7 signs for his purpose in trying to bring about his literary theme that he's trying to build throughout the book. So Yeshua did many signs during this time, during Passover, right? But Yeshua did not entrust himself to them because he knew all men. He did not need anyone to testify about man, for he knew what was in man. Now, it says here that this was a Passover. Now, in John, it mentions Passover 3 times, and I think we've gone over this before. Here, and then John chapter 6 mentions Passover again, and of course, at the end of John, mentions Passover again. So this is where we get the idea of 3.5 years, possibly his ministry was going on, or more. Okay. But it was at least 3 years based on the naming of Passover in John. Now, it says here that many believed in his name. Many believed in his name. And that you would think that, hey, that's great. Yeshua's ministry is being successful. Many believed in his name. Not so much, though. Right? Why is that the case? Well, what does it say here? It says they believed in the signs, which is good, but Yeshua did not entrust himself to them. Literally in the Greek, it's Yeshua did not believe in them. It's the same word that they believed in him, but he did not believe in them. That's literally how it is. It's the same Greek word. And so he's not putting their trust in him. He's not believing in them. Why? Because he knew all men. He knew them because he knew what was in man, right? The question is, what's in man that he doesn't believe in them? Okay. Well, John doesn't really tell us yet. We're going to find out later on, but this is something to keep our eyes to the page. He's saying there's something inside man that Yeshua knew, and that's why he didn't trust himself. In other words, Yeshua was becoming very popular. Oh, Yeshua, you're so great. You do so many signs. And, we believe in you. And Yeshua was like, yeah, okay, that's nice. Right? Because he knew what was in the man. He knew that they were just trusting in the signs and not really trusting in him necessarily. And this is going to be a theme throughout the book of John. we'll see those that say they believe in him, and at the end of the chapter they turn and walk away from him. But then we see others that believe in him, and how do we know that they truly believe? Because they continue to walk in him and believe in his name through the persecution or through the trial, right? So there's two types of belief in the book of John: those who have lip service and those who truly believe in the heart. And we'll see this as we go through this back and forth of truly believing, not really believing, truly believing, not really believing throughout the book of John. Okay. So now that we finished chapter 2, now we're going to look at the theme of how does this all fit together. Because remember, John put these stories here because they're related. So the question is, how are these two stories related? What does a wedding have to do with the temple? How is this all related? Well, let's figure it out together. All right, so here I have in this chart comparing and contrasting the two and seeing the relationship between the two. Okay, so when it comes to the water and wine, the sign of water into wine points to the joy of life Yeshua intends to bring about in the wedding between himself and his people. Because remember, the sign is pointing to something else. My hour has not yet come, right? That's kind of the theme or what is pointing to beyond itself. Okay? Well, let's look at us. My hour has not yet come is referring to the death in which he is the cost to bring about the wedding. Because remember, who's responsible for making sure that the wedding is fully stocked and everything's going correct? It's the groom. He pays the price, right? It says that the purification jars of water and wine shows that it's only through them that one can be brought into the presence of God. It's only through those things that the wedding continue on and be fruitful, right? It's only through Yeshua's work. But then when we compare that with the cleansing the temple, we're going to start down and work our way up. It says here, Yeshua has the authority to cleanse the temple because he is the purifier to sanctify the place where God and his people meet. He is the purifier. He's the one who purifies. Just like the water of purification ceremony was able to bring about the wedding, right? So he is a purifier. He can go in and purify the temple. That's his authority. Also, here we see Yeshua kicks out the merchants because the payment to enter into God's presence is about to be paid. About to be paid. All right? Now, you guys ready for this one? This is my favorite one. Out of the temple of his flesh, water and blood flowed from his side, which guaranteed the union with him and his bride. What happened when Yeshua died on the cross? The spear went through his side, and it says, and blood and water flowed. When was the next time we see Mary again? At the cross when he died, right? So the blood and water that's being referenced to in the wedding ceremony is the hour that is coming when he dies on the cross when blood and water comes. It is the price he needed to pay to bring his bride to himself. So you can see that these themes coming together are related. The wedding and the temple. The presence of God and the entrance into the temple, the purification of the temple, is all one together. Does everyone see that? Okay. Right. Oh, yes. Now I remember what we were going to say. Yes, I remember now. Now, yeah, thank you for bringing it up. So what I was going to say was, how would I talk to somebody, a Christian that, would say that, the temple is here and then we went into their temple and a lot of times Christians, they tend to downplay the temple. That's old. That's, it's death and all that stuff like that. But what's interesting about it is that when you read the book of Ezekiel, and it says when the people were taken out the first time as a result of their disobedience, right? Because there was 2 exiles. That the first exile took out the priests and the leaders of Israel, and then the final, when the destruction of the temple came later. The first time, there's a phrase in the book of Ezekiel. I don't have it now, but I can look for it later. I don't remember. But he says that I will be a mini sanctuary with them when they're in exile. Now, what's interesting is that how is that any different than today? Is God a mini sanctuary with us wherever we go? Yes. So in a sense, when we talk about us being a temple, we're believers before Yeshua. Were they the temple of God as well? Yes. Yes, they were, right? Because they had the Spirit of God dwelling in them the same way we do today. So this is not necessarily a historical thing. This is historical, meaning we have something that they didn't. But the idea is that Yeshua is coming to see what was pointing to the promises to be fulfilled that God had promised to Abraham, Moses, and David. So there's different ways that we have to be careful not to look too far into things before and remember what came before and what they had, even though it's not necessarily mentioned. Okay, so what we have here is, again, this is on your sheet, and what I want to go through here, like I said several weeks ago when we started, I want to go through all the themes that I found throughout the book of John and see if we can find them in chapter 2. So this is also on your sheet. And whenever you're reading the book of John, read this section and go back to this. I find it very helpful for me anyway. So when we look at these words, mostly these are Greek words or specific themes, right? What themes can we see in chapter 2 that's a recurring theme? So just looking at your paper or your screen, what's some of the things we saw in chapter 2 that are on the screen? What's some of the things? Huh? Signs and works, there's one. Belief and faith, okay. Spirit and water, right? Now notice throughout the book of John, we're going to see a relationship between spirit and water, right? Spirit wasn't mentioned here specifically, but we'll see why it's important later on. What else? Okay, so these are the ones I found, so I might have missed a couple. Right? I missed the belief one, so I add that one in there, right? We got the resurrection. We got the glory, right? Remember the glory? And we saw his glory through the sign. Okay. One is life-giving. That's true. I didn't think about that. Okay. All right, so now let's compare it with John chapter 1, first 18 verses. This is also on your sheet, okay? Because remember, what I'm saying is that everything in the first 18 verses in John are going to be throughout the book of John. This is going to help us guide us in the interpretation of John. So what's some of the things that we see here that are in chapter 2? What are some of the things we see? Well, the first one I found was easy was, we beheld and received his glory, right? That was an easy one, right? And we saw his glory after they saw the sign because you needed faith to do that. Okay? What's another one? Light and darkness? Maybe. Okay, where did you see that in chapter 2? Okay, I didn't think about that. I guess you can look at it that way. I didn't see that. Yeah, because I did mention it was probably in reference to Creation Week. So that's a good one. Yep, there you go. That one's one too. The Torah points to realizing Yeshua. Yep, I think that's coming up next. I also put the Word became flesh and he tabernacled among us. Remember, he says this is the body. That's in John 14, right? The Word became flesh and he tabernacled among us. It says, what was the tabernacle? It was his physical body, it was his flesh, right? And that's what's to destroy this temple, and I will raise it up. And he talked about his body, okay? Another one is light shines in darkness, and the world did not understand it. So when he says something, it was misunderstood. They didn't understand what he was saying until later on. So again, this is again a constant theme. Yeshua's going to say something, and people are going to say, what? Like when he says, like, eat my flesh and drink my blood. What? So that's one that's commonly misunderstood, right? But Yeshua is saying these words, and it's being misunderstood. All right. Any other ones up there that I might have missed? Some of the Torah points to realize the Messiah. I think I did write that down. I forgot to put it up there. Right. Believing. Yeah, you're right. That's one of it. Right? Though you believe, you become a child of God. Right. It was about faith. Okay, that's a good one. Now, I want to look at here comparing the book of John with the book of Revelation, because now we're coming to the end of the section here. How do we compare the book of John to the book of Revelation? Because remember, book of Revelation is, at least what I'm thinking is part 2 of book of John, and it fulfills what's going on in the book of John. Okay, so there's 2 ways of looking at it. Right? We have the consecutive, chapter 1 and chapter 1 of each book are in line with another, goes down the line. And then you also have what is called the chiastic way. The chiastic, meaning the chapter 1 of John 1 is matching the last chapter in the book of Revelation. and vice versa, and it goes all the way through like that. And those happen to find themes. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at certain words and phrases and themes in John and Revelation and see how they match up. All right, so this is always fun for me anyway. So from a consecutive perspective, we see here in John 2:17, it says, Yeshua purges the temple, zeal for your house will consume me. Now, again, remember, whatever is highlighted in green is what's the same Greek word that's used in the book of Revelation. So there's a match there as far as the same Greek word is used. Not necessarily the English word, but the Greek word. Right? Whenever the verse address is highlighted, it means that Greek word is only used once in the book of John and only used once in the book of Revelation to highlight the theme that's going on with it. Okay? Green. See how it's highlighted in green there? Okay. So here it says, Yeshua purifies his church, being zealous, therefore, and repent. Right? That's Revelation chapter 3, verse 19. So again, the word zealous and zeal is the same Greek word. Also here we see here in John chapter 2, 24 and 25, Yeshua knew all men, for he himself knew what was in man. The word know there, okay, is highlighted. And Revelation says, and all the churches shall know that I, Yeshua, am he who searches the minds and hearts. Interesting, right? Now, remember, what's underlined is not necessarily the same word, but the same theme that's going on. So Yeshua says he knows all things in the book of Revelation, and he knows what's in man in the book of John. Okay? And so there's a parallel there. Now, going from a chiastic perspective, and this follows the theme of the wedding of Canaan versus the wedding of the Lamb. These are the two things going back and forth. So here, and this is the only time this Greek word is used, it says in John 2:2, Yeshua and his disciples were invited to his wedding, to this wedding. In the book of Revelation 19:9, it says, blessed are those who are invited to the wedding. Right? That's the only time that's used in the book of John and the book of Revelation. No. No, it's just saying that the theme of going to the wedding is the same thing as being blessed, going to Lamb of the Bride, right? Then it says in John 2, verse 3, it says, Yeshua makes wine. When they ran out of wine, the mother of Yeshua said to him, we have no wine. But in the book of Revelation 19:15, it says, and Yeshua makes wine. He treads the winepress of the wine of the rage of the wrath of the Almighty God. Right? He's bringing the wrath of God. Remember we talked about that, the wrath of the wine. It says here in John verse, go back to that one. Sorry. Does that make sense? You ready? Okay. All right. So then in John 2, 4, 7, and 10, the only time the word is used is, woman, what do I have to do with you? Fill the water pots with water, and they have become drunk with the worst wine. And Revelation 17, 1 through 2, 4, and 6, and the woman who sat on the waters had her hand on the golden cup filled with abominations, and they drunk the wine of her fornication. The woman was drunk with the blood of the saints. See, in the book of Revelation, the wine is never used as a positive way. And John 3:29, and John the Baptist rejoiced because he hears his voice of the bridegroom. Who is this? That's chapter 3. Sorry, I went ahead of myself. I did skip a chapter, didn't I? We're gonna skip that part. It is, but we'll save that for next week. Chapter 2, verse. This is the divine wrath. Okay, I wanted to read this real quick because I forgot to bring this up. But the gospel account of the wedding of Cana is clearly written with the Revelation marriage supper of the Lamb in view. The extent of overlapping vocabulary and the conjunction of theme is unmistakable. Both accounts speak of this call to the wedding in John 2:2 and Revelation 19:9. Both accounts speak of the coming of the hour of judgment, John 2:4 and Revelation 18:8. The gospel of Yeshua has the water pots of purification filled with water and becomes wine. In Revelation, the great whore, the impostor bride, has a cup filled with abominations. Yeshua makes the wine for both weddings. After the whore and her suitors are drunk, the Lord serves the wine of the cup, the wrath of God. Having served the better wine of grace of the gospel, Yeshua serves the worse wine with the wrath in Revelation, after the unrepentant are drunk. Thus, Yeshua has respected the wedding custom announcement in John 2:10. Right? Oh, that was very good. All right. And John, when we talk about the divine wrath poured out on the earthly temple versus the divine wrath poured out on from the heavenly temple, it says, in John 2:15, it says, Yeshua poured out the coins of the money changers and drove them out of the temple. This is the only time this Greek word is used because it's highlighted in green, the addresses. But when we look at the book of Revelation, it says in Revelation 16, angels from the heavenly temple pour out the bowls of divine wrath, and there was no one who was able to enter the temple. See how that works? In the book of John 2:16, it says, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. But in Revelation, it says, in Genesis 18:3, the merchants of the earth and the great men shall stand far off in fear of the Babylon's torment. Okay? So the great men is referring to merchants there. John 2:17, zeal for your house has consumed me. But in Revelation it says, in 29, it says, fire came down from God and will consume them. Right? Consume the enemies. In 2:18, the Jews said, what sign do you show us that you have done that you do these things? In Revelation 15:1, it says, angels from the heavenly temple pour out the wrath upon Babylon, and I saw another great sign in heaven. In John 2:19 and 21, destroy this temple. He, Yeshua, is speaking of the temple of his body. But in Revelation it says 21:22, and he saw no temple, for the Lamb of God is a temple. All right, so you can see how the themes of John and Revelation go hand in hand, even down to the very Greek words themselves. And there's a lot more we can go over on this, but these are some highlights that somebody had found, not necessarily me personally, but that have been found. So, dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for sending your Son for us, for paying the price with his blood and his water, the water of purification, his blood of life, that we may live and be in your presence and dwell with you forever. You are most holy. You are the purifier of our sins, and we come to you humbly to worship you and to glorify you in all that we do. May continue to give us the power of faith and strength in you to be your disciples. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.